Oh, it'd be good if I'd actually press start on the recording. So carry on. All right. YouTube is live. Now we'll actually go live on the broadcast. And welcome, Hoosier fans, to this week's edition of Assembly Call Radio, where each week we discuss the most important IU basketball stories from the past 7 days, and this week had plenty of them. This is our 74th edition of Assembly Call Radio, and it is our 402nd episode overall of the Assembly Call, recorded on the evening of Thursday, May 3rd, 2018. Your regular host, Jared Morris, is out this week. Apparently, an orientation meeting for his daughter's preschool is more important than another hour of Romeo Langford analysis, so I'm Andy Bottoms, and I'll be guiding you through this week's discussion with our esteemed panel, who I will introduce momentarily. Well, let's begin this week how we begin every episode of the Assembly Call, and that is with our Hoosier Proud banner moment. Romeo Langford is the obvious choice as the banner moment, but we kind of did that on our recap show on Monday, so I'll take it in a slightly different direction. But with the commitments this week from Romeo Langford and Evan Fitzner more recently today, we're now a Juwan Morgan draft decision away from locking down the season's roster. And the excitement for this upcoming season is growing despite being just a few days into May. You had people lining up outside New Albany High School hours before the doors opened for Romeo's announcement. You had thousands of people in attendance when he put on that IU hat. You had tens of thousands of people watching online. And we even convened a 6-person show to talk about all of it in the immediate aftermath, which had more live viewers than any post-game show that we can recall and probably any that we've ever had. If you think about where things were with the program after IU lost to Georgia Tech in March of 2017, that's a pretty big turnaround in less than 14 months. So to go from punting a home game in the NIT to listening to Jared and Ryan argue on Monday night whether it was in any way realistic to compare IU's team this year to the Syracuse team with Carmelo Anthony that won the NCAA tournament, that's a long way to go. And ultimately, those are the fun parts of being a fan, being able to dream a little bit, have some hope for where things are going and for the upcoming season. And 14 months ago, that hope just wasn't there. Life comes at you fast, though, and here we are with a passionate fan base galvanized by a coach and a staff who laid out a strategy and to this point have followed through and passed their first series of tests. As we'll talk about later in the show, we've seen this kind of momentum before, and certainly in recent years, it's proven to be unsustainable. No way of knowing whether this time will really be different than what happened after the signings of Jared Jeffries and Eric Gordon or Cody Zeller, but in my gut, it feels different. And all that being said, expectations have now been raised for the upcoming season, and that presents another hurdle for Archie, his staff, and the team to clear. Last year's team struggled to get over the hump in close games, but another year in Miller's system for the veterans, an influx of talent from the newcomers should certainly help. And ideally, the same passion and excitement that we've seen over the course of this week from IU fans should lead to no more empty seats in Assembly Hall and a crowd and an atmosphere that might be good for at least a few more home wins as well. And if all that comes together, the Hoosiers should meet those expectations and get back to the NCAA tournament. There are a lot of questions to be answered about what's realistic from there, but the last time I checked, the only way to get closer to hanging banner number 6 is to earn the right to play for one. All right, now let me introduce my esteemed co-host for this week's show. To my left, we have the founder of the #1 ranked Delphi Bracketology Club, an assistant basketball coach at Western High School, and the host of Talking Hoosier Baseball. He is the coach, Brian Tonsoni. I will warn everyone now, I am using the old way that we record these, so no fancy sound bites, drops of Ryan, or any of that. So for those who tuned in for that, I apologize in advance, but we've still got a great panel. So Brian, it's Tonsoni time. What's on your mind?
It's just a nice time to be an Indiana Hoosier fan again, and hopefully with the signing class that we have and Romeo signing that we're a little more unified. It's been a long, long time since the fan base has even been close to being unified. And hopefully with the signing and the progress that's made, and we had another commitment today, that the fan base can get on board for a while and build on the recruiting momentum. And then we'll mention it over and over again. The other thought is inside out. It was mentioned at the press conference when Archie was hired, and it's been solidly executed so far by the coaching staff in ways that a lot of people did not think possible. And now it has to be done on the court. It has to be in the weight room, in individual workouts, in the team play, and then games have to be won. And that's the next step for all of us to talk about all the way up until November.
And to my right, hopefully he's been able to catch up on some sleep the last couple of days. He's the founder and editor of Inside the Hall, Jared's co-host on Podcast on the Brink, and one of many thousands of New Albany High School graduates who has not yet had his number retired. I know what maybe the best part of Alex's week has been so far, and it was when he posted that there was no downtime on the site in the before, during, and after the Romeo announcement. So feel free to go with that if you want, Alex. But what are your other big takeaways from what I'm sure has been a busy week for you?
Yeah, just a lot of fun. When I started inside the hall 10 years ago, it was I was passionate about writing about IU and following the team, and weeks like this are the reason that really make everything worth it, because obviously the Romeo Langford decision is unlike anything we've seen, and just his recruitment in general has been fascinating to follow. More so specifically for me, just being from New Albany and having seen him play since his freshman year in high school, and the fact that he's such a special player. It was just a really cool scene to see 2,500 people show up on Monday night for a kid's college announcement. That's not something you see every day. And then today, obviously, the good news continued with Indiana picking up Evan Fitzner. It's funny that we hopped on a little bit late here tonight because I was talking to him right before the show, just kind of get his thoughts on his commitment. And he's definitely excited about coming into Indiana and the possibilities next year, just based on what other great players they have coming in. He feels like he can come in and be a senior leader. So it's been a really fun week. I think the next thing now that everyone's going to want to start to talk about is how do all the pieces fit together, and that's something that we'll talk about, I'm sure, here a little bit in this show and as the months go on. It's always fun going into a season when you have a lot of hope for what's next. I think the one thing that really stands out to me is, from a high level, when I look at this team next year, people have been throwing around terms like Elite Eight, Final Four, National Championship, things like that. I think it's going to take some time for these pieces to all fit together. I mean, there's going to be a lot more talent than what we've seen, maybe this past season, but there's going to be also, 6 or 7 new players that are being integrated into a new system, and there's going to be some growing pains along the way. But I agree with what Brian said. I mean, if you're an Indiana fan at this point, you have to feel good just about that. The fact that everything you've heard so far this offseason has been positive news. Nobody's left in terms of transfers. You've got obviously Romeo Langford committing. You've got a guy who's really experienced coming in from St. Mary's who can provide some shooting and some depth in the front court. So, it's been a great week, I think, if you're an Indiana fan, and there's a lot to be excited about.
Absolutely. And so here's some of the topics and questions we're going to hit this week. So the first is going to be talking a little bit about Evan Fitzner, what IU's getting in him, how he fits into the roster. We'll talk about, Jared sent in a topic, kind of comparing Romeo's commitment to, some of those other times that I referenced in the opening, of whether that be Zeller or Eric Gordon, and, how this time might be different. We'll transition a lot into what Alex talked about. So what are kind of, roster-wise, most of those questions have been answered short of Juwan. So now we can get into, what some of the biggest on-court questions are. We have as good an idea as we're probably going to get, at least until Juwan makes his final decision of what the roster will look like. So we'll figure out what those things are, what we should be watching for in the offseason and leading into next season with Romeo in the fold. And then we'll talk a little bit more with Brian about some of the pros and cons of different lineup approaches that Archie might be able to use given the roster that is now taking shape. So we'll hit all that here coming on Assembly Call Radio. And if we have some time, we've got a bunch of Twitter questions. Obviously, everybody was holding back their non-Romeo questions until after he committed. So now we can move forward with a new line of questioning. But before we go any further, I want to take a quick minute to talk about our friends at McBob Auctions. Not that we needed it, but Monday's spectacle at New Albany was a great reminder of just how crazy Hoosiers are about their basketball. And if there's one thing that comes close to the basketball love in Indiana, it's the state's love for auto racing. With the Indy 500 right around the corner and the weather getting nicer, there's a great auction event for families who are looking for something fun to do together. McBob Auctions is hosting their 31st original Spring Classic Car Auction at the Indiana State Fairgrounds May 15th through May 20th, which is a Tuesday through a Sunday. And what will you find at the McBob Auction? 2,000 classic and collector cars, everything from muscle cars and race cars to classics and exotics. But more than that, it's a family-friendly environment that makes it perfect for a family outing. And there will also be some big-name sports tie-ins as well. MLB Hall of Famer Reggie Jackson will be selling 18 cars from his private collection. And Meekum will be offering the green 1967 Corvette that was gifted to Bart Starr for winning the Super Bowl I MVP award. There's also a road art auction simultaneous to the car auction. This includes porcelain and neon signs, gas and oil collectibles, pedal cars, and more. The gates open daily at 7:30 a.m. Tickets and bidder registration is available in advance at Meekum.com. Again, it's Meekum's 31st original spring classic car auction at the Indiana State Fairgrounds, Tuesday, May 15th through Sunday, May 20th. Go to Meekum.com for more information. You're listening to Assembly Call Radio. I'm Andy Bottoms here with the coach, Brian Tonsoni, and Alex Bozich from Inside the Hall. And guys, let's kind of jump in. We had a quick audible for what we were going to cover first, but the Evan Fitzner commitment, 6'10" guy from St. Mary's, comes in as a grad transfer. So talk a little bit about what we're getting with him. Just a couple, statistical things from an efficiency standpoint. He's been really good every year. His lowest offensive rating was a year ago when he was at a 112.8. Which included 124.5 in West Coast Conference play. So, really efficient player, shoots the ball well from three-point range. I think that's the big draw for him. Has been over 40% in all 3 years of his career, and has also shot the ball well from two-point range. This year, he was 71% on twos in West Coast Conference play. And in terms of rebounding, defensive rebounding percentage of at least 16% in each of his 3 seasons. So, a guy who I think battled some injuries last year, but an interesting piece for IU. Alex, I'll go to you first since you just talked to him and also, had news of this up right away on the site and talked to his family as well. What kind of player is IU getting in Evan Fitzner?
I think the main takeaway that I got from just talking to his dad, he had nothing but good things to say about his experience at St. Mary's, but I think he's looking for an opportunity where maybe there's a faster tempo in terms of style play. And one thing his dad mentioned to me oftentimes in the West Coast Conference, they had a really good big man there at St. Mary's, and teams would go smaller, and Evan wouldn't get as many minutes because he didn't match up as well against smaller lineups. And I think one thing he specifically mentioned is he thinks that Evan's excited about playing in the pack line type of defense. Just from my conversation with Evan, one thing he mentioned was this summer is going to be crucial for him in terms of putting on some weight. I think he mentioned he wanted to put on 10 or 15 pounds. He specifically mentioned Cliff Marshall as being a quote, an asset to the program. He's looking forward to working with him. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see how the front court rotation shakes out, because you have a lot of different things that you're going to be able to do. If you're Archie Miller, you have some small lineups you're going to be able to go to with guys like Race Thompson or Jake Forrester. But then you've also got Clifton Moore, who's lingering out there. We'll see how he develops. Deron Davis coming back from injury. And then, of course, Juwan Morgan. For a team that this past season, it almost seemed like they were desperate for answers at times in the front court. It seems like this group's going to be a lot more well-rounded. And with Fitzner, you mentioned the three-point shooting. With a guy like Romeo Langford on the perimeter, and if Juwan Morgan comes back, if he's a 40% three-point shooter, he's going to have plenty of opportunities to get open looks with defenses concentrating on those guys. So I think it's a great add from that perspective.
Yeah, well, Jared tweeted something out from the Assembly Call account when it happened, and Sam Vecini from The Athletic wrote him back. So a couple of his comments. Fitzner shoots the blank out of it. That's one of Sam's favorite phrases. Anybody who listens to his podcast with any regularity. Was battling injury last year too. Pure depth insurance addition, in his opinion. But he also said, catch and shoot, spot up, stretch big, good mobility, fluid athlete at his size, not a tough rebounder, even though the numbers suggest he was at least relatively effective rebounding or interior defender. I think that speaks a little bit to what Alex talked about with wanting to put on some weight. Just says definitely a perimeter big, but I think, again, a pick and pop guy, give IU some different looks out there. Brian, were you, I think we talked about this on prior shows and trying to figure out if IU was going to look for a grad transfer, which I think a lot of people, they certainly were in the market and mentioned with a number of guys. We kind of, went back and forth about whether we thought that'd be another guard or a big guy. Did it say anything to you? Were you surprised that it was a big guy, or do you think this ends up being a pretty good fit for what IU already has in the fold?
When we initially discussed it, I thought it was going to be more of a guard because they needed extra shooters. Well, the shooting part of that was right, but they went to a big. I think it mentions to me that there is a a little bit of insurance with Duran's injury being a major concern. And then, as we saw last year, we had talented freshmen, but they had up and down parts of the season, and everyone's development is different. And while we're getting, Romeo is going to be outstanding, and the other guys are going to be good too, but they have some up and downs in their first year. And Alex mentioned how young the team is going to be. And this brings in some experience. And there have been a lot of success with grad transfers, and I'm sure we can go through college basketball and find some that didn't quite work out. But in the Big Ten, it seems that they have worked out. Max Bielfeld here was nice. You just saw what happened with Ohio State with Dockage. And so with a young team, bringing some experience, someone who's played in some talented competition, started some games, been in the NCAA tournament, that's valuable. And especially if Juwan does not come back, but we think he will. So the shooting's nice, but it tells me that they want to have a little bit of depth there, but I don't think you bring him in and not play him. So I think he's going to be a regular in the rotation somewhere. And if he's not, then the other guys really develop well, and that's a plus.
Yeah, I agree. I was a little bit surprised, but I do think it makes some sense. It gives, a number of the guys are going to be counting on are either, coming off of injury in Duran's case or going to be first-year players. Race Thompson has obviously been there. So I do think it gives some insurance. And on a team that desperately lacks shooting, it certainly sounds like it gives them a guy who's going to be able to knock down some shots. And as Alex said, I think there should be no shortage of open looks given the personnel. So I think a good thing for everybody involved. So coming up, we're going to talk a little bit about whether this latest in-state commitment with Romeo Langford is going to be different than others we've seen in the past. We'll hit that next on the Assembly Call Radio. Stick with us. All right, 16:36. I should write that down somewhere. All right, well, welcome everybody on YouTube. Sorry for our late start. It really, as much as I tried to pin it on Alex having that interview, it was really, we were having some technical things to work out, as is always the case when Jared's in here. So this is not shocking to anyone, but
I'll take the blame.
We have powered through. We've got sure good content coming up on Inside the Hall about the commitment as soon as we wrap up here, and hopefully a good show for you tonight. So
actually, I might go to sleep and give some content in the morning.
All right, even better. I'm sure you could use it.
Alex, real quick, the Forster and Thompson, are those more perimeter guys, or those more traditional post-up guys? I asked that because this Fitzner, I wonder if Archie would ultimately like a big who can defend the rim but also play outside a little bit more than a traditional center. Are we moving away from a traditional center once Duran graduates, or are we going to have people like that if they're good enough? I just wondered with this pick and pop kind of 5 or 4.
Yeah, well, Forster's more of an inside player on both ends, although he runs the floor pretty well. Race Thompson can step out a little bit. I mean, when I saw him at AAU, he had a pretty good mid-range game. I don't think he's going to be like a guy that's shooting threes a bunch. But, in a lot of ways last year, the way they played after Duran got hurt kind of tells me that, if they can get a really good big man that's back to the basket, you do that, but then they're going to have ways to play without one, because, with Freddie and Juwan last year, they didn't really have a center, but they were able to still find some success by, just kind of being, a small ball type of team. So I would say Forster's more of a traditional big, although he's only, I think, 6'8" or 6'9". He's not really like a guy that you're just going to call an ISO for and throw the ball in the post like you will with Duran sometimes. But I think he's going to be a guy that primarily finds his offense from offensive rebounds and running to the rim and kind of the junk points. So it'll be interesting.
You see that a lot in college basketball, and you just see those guys that, are more runners. I call them rim running after you set the screen and they just run to the rim for an alley-oop or whatever else, those types of, rather than back to the basket guys.
Yeah, if you've got a guy that you can throw it into the post and let him go to work, but there's not that many guys like that anymore. Like, I think every year we talk about like the lack of post-up bigs. Even like look at Jahlil Okafor. He was a dominant post player at Duke in college, and now he can't even find a role in the NBA. So it's it's rare now. I think this is the way the game's kind of trending. I mean, I'd rather have a guy who can run the floor, and ideally you want a big guy like Cody who's ultra skilled but runs the court like a gazelle. So
I agree.
Cool. All right. Well, we'll kind of hit that other in-state recruiting topic that Jared sent. We got a couple questions that were related to kind of other commitments that this might trigger. So I'll try to. This seems like the most logical place to fit that in. So I'll try to do that, and then we can get into some of those questions after the kind of midway through. We'll see how long it goes on this first part. However long we want to take it is fine. All right, I will probably should save off this file. Right, do something. You're listening to the Assembly Call. I'm Andy Bottoms, filling in this week as your host here with Coach Brian Tonsoni and Alex Bozich from Inside the Hall. And don't forget, if you ever have to miss all or part of an episode of Assembly Call Radio, there are two great ways to catch up. You can subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Just search for Assembly Call. Or you can join our live Thursday night broadcast or watch the video replays by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/assemblycall. So the next topic I wanted to touch on was one that Jared sent. I thought it was an interesting angle to look at the Romeo commitment. And so the way he worded this was to kind of compare how it felt to things either in 2008 when Eric Gordon committed or 2011 with Cody Zeller. And as I think many people have mentioned, those have, we look back on those as, kind of the last times that IU got a really elite player from inside the state. And so everybody felt great at the time, seemed like big momentum shifts, everything going in the right direction, and then never really were able to sustain, at least in over multiple seasons, the momentum that seemed to be there with each. And as he put it, each time the program went off the rails soon thereafter. And so I guess ultimately the question becomes, why do we think this time should be any different? So Brian, I'll throw that to you first. What do you view as different about the Romeo commitment and where the program sits right now to, the Gordon and Zeller commitments in particular?
Well, I think that's an excellent question for Alex. He's been covering for 10 years, but I'm going to throw it just real quick in this point of view. It depends on the coach and the coaching staff. And if you just look at it from a coaching standpoint, 2008, our coaching staff didn't follow through. In fact, did some things, and we're all aware of that. And then after 2011, there seemed to be some, I don't want to call them empty recruiting classes, but some recruiting classes that didn't quite mesh, I guess, the way they might have been planned. And the movement didn't end up being the movement other than Yogi. And so I think there were, the Archie's got to continuously recruit. Getting Romeo this year is great, but then he has to continuously add players if he's going to get Indiana back to blue blood status. That's what Kansas does. That's what Duke does. And I'm not saying we're back there, but if we want to be consistently a Sweet 16 and maybe further type of team, we've got to recruit and we got to hit more years than not. So the difference to me is we have a coach, and we'll be able to tell if this is a better coaching situation in 2 or 3 years if this kind of recruiting continues.
Alex, what about you after having, covered the Romeo recruitment so closely these last, particularly over the last year, but even, leading up to that a little bit? I know you covered the Zeller recruitment as well. I'm not sure. I think the Eric Gordon one was right before I think you started the site. But I mean, what's your view on this question? Do you really think it's different, or is there, if people have pause about this, do you think that's fair or no?
I mean, you'd like to say it's different, but I don't think anyone can say for sure until we're, 3 or 4 years down the line from now, because as Brian mentioned, it's not just about getting Romeo. It's about what do you do in 2019? What do you do in 2020? What do you do in 2021? And going back to the last time when they got a great in-state player. Now, I mean, I think Yogi and James Blackman qualify as Yogi is obviously a great player. James Blackman probably considered a good player. But you look at the rest of those classes. I mean, you follow up 2011. With Cody, you had Austin Etherington, who didn't bring a whole lot to the table, and you had Remy Abel, who transferred out. And then 2012, you had Yogi, and then you had pretty much nothing that went along with him. I guess Honor had some moments, and then 2013, you had, Colin Hartman, Troy Williams, that really panned out. I mean, I'm trying to think, Stan Robinson. There was too many guys that were just didn't bring, whether it was only the fact that 2013 had Vonleh too. He was a one and done, but too many instances where you had a guy that it either didn't pan out or didn't perform kind of up to expectations. So as excited as people are right now, and this is not me being cynical or anything, it's just you have to wait and see what happens beyond. I think most of us think that Romeo is probably going to be a one-year player, but if he leads to a Keon Brooks or a Trace Jackson Davis in 19, and then in 2020 you get a Trey Galloway, and you get some other national recruits that you can build sustained success year over year. I mean, that was the one thing that Tom Crean was never able to do in Indiana. He had some really good teams, but it was always a roller coaster from year to year. And I think what Archie and the staff are trying to do now is more similar to an approach like Villanova, where you bring in great player, but then you also have 2 or 3 guys in every class that are going to be solid 3 or 4 year players, and then your young players develop and they become seniors, and then you just replenish them in the younger classes, and that's not what Indiana was under Tom Crean. And if they're going to be mentioned, I mean, I don't think unless you're Kentucky and Duke, you can sustain success in college basketball by recruiting one and dones every year. I mean, if you're going to be consistently good, you have to bring in, I think, at minimum 2 or 3 players in every class that are going to develop in your program and be solid 3 to 4 year guys. You can afford to have guys leave early when that happens, but when guys leave early and you don't have that, that's when you have the seasons with a huge drop off. So I think we'll have a better feeling 2 or 3 years from now if that's going to be the case. But I think just right now it's impossible to say that for sure.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think that's one thing we've talked about before. I think at some point last offseason, we had discussions on here about what program you wanted to emulate. And I think we probably all revisited that over the course of this year and said, Villanova, it was an answer I don't think anybody gave, but it probably was the one we should have given.
Right.
But I think you look now and you see, some of the other guys in this class. Obviously, Romeo is the headliner. There's no question about that. But I think when you look at guys like Finnessy and Hunter and Race Thompson, who, for all intents and purposes, we should, consider part of this class, and those kinds of guys, I think you see guys who are going to be there for a while and will be the guys who can pass that torch to other guys as you go through. And certainly great to get the superstar like Romeo. But if those other guys aren't there, there's probably a lot of examples that we could cite, even in the last few years, of guys who came into college really talented, were surrounded by other guys who couldn't really help them succeed. And while they've gone on to do fine in the NBA, they didn't really have a great college experience. So, Alex, you brought this up, and I think it's probably the best place to ask this question. We called for questions. We certainly got a number of those who have, now that Romeo's in the mix, everybody's moved on to who the next person is. And that was one of the things that was talked about with him committing, making it okay for, elite in-state kids to go to IU again and some of those kinds of things. IU's in good position, it sounds like, with a number of other guys in next year's class in particular. Do you think there's any somewhat immediate domino effect of Romeo committing, or most of the guys that they're in with not really that close to making a decision?
It's impossible to say because you never know with a 16, 17, 18-year-old kid what they're going to do. I would say, the guys I just mentioned, Trace Jackson Davis, I think they're in great position there, and Keon Brooks, they've done a lot of work there. So, I think those are 2 of the really, obviously, the key recruitments in 2019 to keep an eye on. I think the interesting thing to me right now at this stage in 2019, at least with the recruiting strategy, is just kind of the guards, they've kind of obviously DJ Carton, the kid from Iowa, that they've put a lot of work in, but it doesn't seem like any of the in-state kids are really progressing much in terms of an offer. I mean, they've offered a lot of kids that are outside the state, so I think this could be a class where you see, they obviously want the two big in-state 5-star kids, but where they may have to go to different areas to fill out the rest of the recruiting class because, Armand Franklin, the kid from Cathedral, has got some high major offers and attention, but they haven't offered him at this point. I don't know if that's coming. Brandon Newman, the kid from Valparaiso, is another kid who's a pretty talented class of 2019 kid. I think a core junior all-star in the state, and he's played really well this spring. He hasn't gotten an offer. I would have thought, if either one of those, either of those guys were, solid candidates to get offers, it would have come by now. So we'll see there. But, it's impossible to say like kind of how this changes things. I mean, I think it doesn't hurt anything. I mean, a guy like Trace Jackson Davis seems to be pretty close with Romeo. Obviously, I don't think he would ever play with him unless Romeo stays more than 1 year, which I don't think any of us think is going to happen. But yeah, I mean, it could definitely start a domino effect. And when you have a top 5 player coming to your program, it's just a good headline that you can show to other people and maybe open some doors with other kids that wouldn't have been open otherwise.
And what I like about is how he committed and what made him commit. And watching Archie Miller coach during that Northwestern game, that could speak to other big-name recruits and 5-star recruits that, okay, here's Romeo, a top 5 guy, and he likes the way Archie that we need to watch. And Alex mentioned Cliff Marshall. What a strength that is turning out to be to sell to recruits too. And then Ed Schilling with his development is another thing that I heard. So Archie and staff really might help those dominoes fall. And then that answers the previous question too. If you can get decent classes multiple years in a row with some 3-4 year guys who want to come in and develop. And I think you're going to start seeing more people really take Indiana serious in the recruiting because of this commitment but the method and the things that the people are saying about why they committed.
I'm Andy Bottoms here with the coach Brian Tonsoni and Alex Bozich from Inside the Hall discussing the latest and greatest in IU basketball. So one of the things I wanted to kind of talk about next, as we looked at, wild cards or things to look at heading into the season, they all really centered around the roster and Romeo to this point. Well, now that he's here, I'm curious to get you guys' thoughts on what really the biggest on-court questions are for IU next year. I think point guard play is certainly one. Duran's health is another, although the Fitzner signing, I think, mitigates that question a little bit. Could just be how the minutes get, doled out across these guys as now the roster and the depth is exciting for those of us who watch or cover the team, but probably, makes it tough for Archie to figure out how all those go. So, Alex, I'll go to you first. What do you think the biggest lingering question is at this point, outside of, personnel? Kind of take Juwan's decision out of it. I think that's the next obvious one, but what big questions what's the biggest question you have going into next season at this point?
I would say the minutes, because I was thinking about this earlier. Not only do you have 13 scholarship players, you have a non-scholarship player in Zach McRoberts who started most of the season. So, and it's not like a situation where we've had recent years where there's, a scholarship player who's never going to play, like a Tim Priller. This is all these are all guys who you figure have a chance to find minutes. So you can't play 14 guys. And I think ideally Archie doesn't want to play more than 8 or 9, 10 guys at the most. And so who are the guys who are going to really separate themselves? And this makes for an interesting environment in terms of practice and workouts, because, there was times last season where Archie had to play guys who maybe otherwise wouldn't have gotten minutes, but it was just out of necessity based on what he had on the roster. Now you kind of flip the page and you say, you know what, if Race Thompson, for example, doesn't, do the things that he needs to do, he's not going to play. You can pretty much say that about most of the guys on the roster outside of the top 2 or 3 guys. And so I think it's going to be fascinating to watch how that develops. And the other thing, I agree with you on the point guard. And and maybe a little bit of a question on the guard depth. I think looking at what they have, in terms of guys I would consider to be guards, I would say, obviously they just have Romeo, Devontae Green, Al Durham, and then Finney as guys who can really handle the ball well. So that's another question mark I would have. But otherwise, I think you'd rather be in the position of you have too many guys and you don't have enough. So it's not a bad problem to have.
Yeah, I know. I think last year got dangerously close to not having enough at times. So I'm with you there. Brian, what about you? What's the biggest thing on your mind right now?
Point guard play is always important from a coach's standpoint. When we had good point guard, we played better, and it'll be interesting to see how that competition plays out. But I'm going to go with defense. How soon can these young kids who have played high school basketball, AAU basketball, come in and play the defense that's needed to win consistently in the Big Ten and the NCAA? We saw Justin Smith have troubles defensively early. And if we go, we'll talk lineups later, but if he has to play the three, if we go big, if Indiana goes big, can he guard the three spot, the wing on the floor effectively? How soon do these young guys? That's going to be the big on the floor thing for me to watch early in the season. Archie said at one time it took 2 or 3 years to really get it implemented at Dayton. And we're in the second year with a young team and some new players. So that'll be something that I'll be watching. It got better this year. Where does it start at, and how much improvement and how quick does it improve?
All right. Well, up next, we're going to toss around some of those potential lineup ideas that Brian talked about. And if we have time, we'll start to dip into some of the questions that we got from Twitter. That's next on the Assembly Call. Stick with us. Yeah, the guard depth is interesting. Like, you didn't really, I didn't really, I think Jared or somebody tweeted out. I think we talked about it before, and I think that's why some of the grad transfer stuff seemed fit well with a guard, because there wasn't a whole lot there. But those guys are going to play a lot. I mean, it'll be interesting to see how they divvy that out. But there's a lot of, for a team last year that was woefully short on front court options, it seems like the pendulum has swung far in the other direction this year.
What's Hunter's best spot if you went to the traditional 1 through 5 numbers? Which one does he fit best?
I mean, you can play the 3 or the 4, stretch 4 or 3. I think his ball handling needs to get better, but I think you can say that just about about every player coming into college.
Do we consider Demizi to be a guard in the guard depth if needed, or is he more of that 3?
Maybe more of a 3 though, more of a wing shooter, scorer. He gets off the bus and then he walks in the gym and he starts scoring. That's what he does.
All right, we'll hit some of these couple lineup things, and then I tried to divvy up the questions in a way that made sense. So there's a couple. The first set, if we get to those this time, is a little bit more roster related, preseason expectations, things like that. So I may not get to all of them, but I tried to divvy them up that way, and then the ones that will be left for the last segment can maybe be more quick hit. We got about 20 minutes left of recording time by my expert math on the subject. Get this file. You are listening to the Assembly Call. Go to assemblycall.com right now to learn how to subscribe to our email newsletter or text IU to 66866. If you want to get more out of being an IU basketball fan, then you need to be on our newsletter list. You'll get our weekly 6-banner Sunday news roundups, as well as our post-game analysis emails once the season begins. It's all free, and it will make you a smarter IU basketball fan. So go to assemblycall.com or text IU to 66866. I'm Andy Bottoms, taking over the reins this week as the host, here with the coach, Brian Tonsoni, and Alex Bozich from Inside the Hall. And so one of the things that we wanted to touch on was, you start looking a little bit, Alex mentioned guard depth in the last segment, just as kind of where, this roster is starting to shake out. And I think one of the interesting things for me is to start to figure out what some potential lineups would look like. I joked after the announcement that John Rothstein had tweeted out the projected lineup, so any questions about what it would be could be put to rest. But assuming that he might not be correct about
Did he really
what that
do
lineup,
that?
yeah, he did something. Yeah, it was something to the effect of, I think it was Duran, Juwan, Justin Smith, Romeo Langford, and Devontae Green, where he's just like, oh, projected starters or whatever. So obviously a good thing to do in late April, early May. So he threw that out. But assuming that we're not buying into that, or at least we want to explore the possibility that he could be wrong. There's some interesting options in terms of like playing big or small. The one that he threw out where you're playing, a big man. So maybe that's Duran, maybe that's Fitzner in this case. Forrester, somebody else, plus Juwan, plus Justin Smith at the 3, where you end up having a pretty big lineup. Or you've got options to go with Juwan at the 5, Justin Smith at the 4, or maybe a Zach McRoberts at the 3, or something like that. So I think you've got some flexibility. So, Brian, I was curious to get your, put your coach's hat on here and kind of talk through what some of the pros and cons are of either of those approaches.
Yeah, it's just based. You could do it on matchups. It's based on maybe what you want to accomplish. But one of the things that I think coaches do is who can you guard? Which lineup is best to guard on a consistent basis, and whether that's who you're playing or overall. And as I mentioned earlier, can Smith guard the 3 if you go Smith at the 3 and Juwan at the 4 and a Fitzner or a Davis or whoever at the 5. I do think the roster is currently setting up we have some depth at the bigs if Juwan comes back to play a little more big. And I know that Archie likes that size, that 6'5" to 6'9" type of athlete at a variety of positions. But in the past, he played 3 guards. And was that just because of the roster this year? Or is Romeo going to slide down to the 3 and they play Durham at the 2 and Devontae at the 1? And if you're going to play people lots of minutes and you can have a rotation there and slide someone in. But I think it, if you can have bigs with length who can guard the dribble, I think you might see more of a big lineup, at least to start, unless there's a matchup problem.
Alex, what do you think? This idea of Justin Smith playing the 3, and maybe you can expand this to some of the other new guys coming in. Do you think that's where he ultimately slots in best, where Archie thinks he can be most effective? Or that to me is a question. I think the defensive question that Brian brought up about playing him at the 3 is probably the biggest one in my mind. But do you think that's ultimately where Archie sees him fitting in?
Yeah, it's an interesting question because he was a guy that just at times this year looked, really good in certain situations defensively, and then he had other games where he had lapses. And so I think with his athleticism and a year under his belt, I think he's going to be a guy who can, in a small ball lineup, he can play the 4, and then if you go big, he can play the 3. The other thing I like about this about the new guys that they're bringing in, Romeo can guard. I watched Romeo guard Darius Baisley this season in a high school game. Now he's a 6'8", 6'9" guy who's going to the G League, a top 20 player in the league, in the country that like to play inside. He blocked a shot a couple times. So I don't think it's out of the question that Romeo is going to be able to guard 1 through 3 when he needs to. I don't think it's out of the question that Jerome Hunter can guard multiple spots just based on his size and his length. The Jake Forrester, similar, good shot blocker, a guy who has ability to guard in the post and also probably, as Brian talked about, guard ball screens. I think that's the one question mark I have going forward about Duran is how does he guard ball screens? And because the college game is so dependent on, Archie's style of play is they don't switch anything, right? So you got to be able to hold your own regardless. And I think the one thing that they got burned on a lot early in the season last year was the help and recover and the basic concepts of the pack line. And so I think the one thing that just stands out to me is, sorry to ramble here a little bit about this whole group that's coming in, is just the versatility that they could potentially have defensively, that really kind of expands the possibilities in terms of a lineup. I mean, it'll be fascinating next year to see just how many different lineups are used, particularly early in the season, just trying to mix and match different combos to see what works, what doesn't work. We haven't even mentioned Zach McRoberts, who was one of the team's best perimeter defender at times last year. And, we're automatically assuming that some of these young guys are going to come in and take minutes. I don't think he's just going to automatically say, I'm a walk-on, I'm going back to the bench. These guys are all going to compete day in and day out in practice. But going back to your original question, I think Justin Smith has the athleticism and the ability to play different positions. But ultimately, I think on next year's team specifically, they'd be best suited if he could play the three, because, wow, think of a lineup where you've got, six, whatever the point guard's going to be, if it's Devontae or Finney, but then you got 6'6" at the 2 guard, you got 6'7" at the 3, you got Juwan at the 4, potentially 6'7", 6'8", and then you have Duran or Fitzner or Forrester, whoever is going to play the 5. That's a huge lineup. I mean, that's a lot different than what they had this year with, Devontae and Josh Newkirk and Robert Johnson out there.
Yeah, I think Roberts is interesting because he kind of bridges the gap between some of these lineup options because of the way he can guard and how hard he plays. And I think one of the things that was an issue, I guess if you want to call it that, last year was we were talking about, is he really going to look at the hoop? Can he score enough? I think now you're getting to a point where this team's going to have enough offensive options with a guy like Romeo, certainly, but where I think this upcoming year's team might be a little bit better equipped to be able to cover up for some of those offensive deficiencies in McRoberts' game. And like you said, I certainly don't think he's going to give up those minutes. And when you look at what Archie values from a defensive perspective, I don't know that he's going to be all that eager to relinquish minutes from a guy who he knows what he's going to get out of defensively on a night in and night out basis. So I think he really becomes an interesting piece of how the minutes end up doling themselves out and really how much he plays, because he's one of the few guys that kind of can easily slide into a few different places in the lineup.
Yeah, I think McRoberts is, I've been anointed to have his fan club next year by Jared because coaches can't resist. And sometimes you don't necessarily play your best 5 to start. Sometimes, you mix and match and have offensive players come off the bench. So when you do sub, you have an offensive boost coming off the bench. And McRoberts is the kind of guy that coaches like because he does almost everything right and he hustles and can set the tone. And so there might be a situation where he starts out at the 3 if he earns that. As Alex said, he's not going to give up that position. And sometimes you play someone who's not as good offensively if they do everything else because a lot of players would prefer to just play offense sometimes, and you need to remind your team by divvying out those points. So I think it's going to be interesting to see. But I think McRoberts still has a huge role on this team as a senior leader and as a player that is almost very similar to Archie in toughness, I think.
Yep, I agree. You're listening to the Assembly Call. I'm Andy Bottoms here with Coach Brian Tonsoni and Alex Bozich from Inside the Hall. And guys, let's dig into a few of the questions that we got either on Twitter or in the Slack community that we have on the Assembly Call. So, Alex, I'll throw this one to you first, if for no other reason than the person who submitted it was Alex. So maybe you, teeing up a question for yourself. Considering last year's transfers and seniors, which position do you think is most improved by the incoming class, including race? And we'll throw Fitzner in the mix here since he committed today.
Most improved
position is the
shooting guard. Yeah. Shooting guard, and that's not taking anything away from Robert Johnson, who was I know you're the Robert Johnson fan here, but I mean, Robert Johnson's a great college player, but Romeo Langford's a potential NBA 10 to 15 year player in the league. So I think just from a pure talent standpoint and I've had multiple national guys tell me that they believe that they think Romeo could be the top freshman scorer in the country next season, and that's not anything to just brush away lightly. So I would say shooting guard, and then I'm obviously interested to see what happens with point guard, because I think Robert Finney coming in could help elevate the game of Devontae Green, because if he doesn't elevate his game, then he's going to lose minutes. So I think it's going to be some fascinating battles, particularly in the backcourt. But I mean, overall, just going back to my earlier point, I just think the overall talent on the roster, you look at what is leaving and what's coming in, and it's pretty lopsided in terms of overall talent. What's coming in, you would take that most times over what's departing.
Yeah, Brian, you have thoughts on the position most improved?
I agree. I mean, you get Romeo, and that's a huge improvement. Coach's dream, go score. Call a timeout, 30-second timeout. Okay, Romeo, get the ball to Romeo, go score. That makes a lot of coaches look smart, and I mean, I like Archie anyway, but I do think our post play with depth and the competition, that it'll ultimately be better. And we have a variety of types of players to throw in there at the 5, and we have some depth to give Juwan a rest, or if he's in foul trouble. I don't know that. Boy, when he hit the bench, you held your breath last year because you'd go 13 minutes without him in the first half. You just hoped you were in a ball game. I think we have some ability to close that gap. So that would be my second position.
Yeah, I think one of the ones that's interesting that we didn't mention, I think shooting guard, to Alex's point, is the most obvious answer. But I think the 3 spot is going to be interesting, because if you really look back at the roster from last year, I don't know that there were a lot of maybe I'm blocking somebody out of my mind, but just a guy that really fit that kind of wing scorer or something like that. So I think you could see, maybe Justin Smith can slip into that role. Maybe it's Jerome Hunter, those kinds of guys. I think that those are some interesting pieces. And I think with what we talked about to open this segment, just the roster versatility and the size and length that they're going to be able to put out there is pretty exciting. So certainly, I think a lot of pieces we hope to be improved, and time will tell the answer on that. But I think answering shooting guard to start is a good place to sit.
We got to give Finney a little love. I mean, he killed us. So I'm glad he's graduating and going to Indiana. I think that position too is going to get a competition boost.
Yep, I would agree. All right. Well, we are going to answer more of your questions next in our final segment here on the Assembly Call. So stick with us, and we'll hit as many as we can in the last few minutes. I have to do some quick math here, figure out how much time we have left, but I don't think it's a lot, so we'll try to just quick hit some things.
I think Finney's got, every freshman has some things to learn, but what I was so impressed with him coaching against him and watching film was he's a point guard, and he's going to find players. And then, then he also has the ability to score. I think, boy, we've been missing that true point guard mentality. And I think a lot of people are going to be surprised at how well he plays given the adjustment.
Yeah. I love Finney. He's just he's a winning player. I mean, he's not like an athlete or anything that'll blow you away. I think that's one thing that maybe kept him down a little bit in the rankings. But he just does everything so well. I mean, he's a smart player. I think he's improved his shooting over time. He's unselfish. I think other guys will like playing with him. I mean, that was one of the things that stood out from Mr. Langford's comments after the press conference, was he mentioned Garland almost in not a negative way, but mentioned that he would have the ball in his hands a lot more than Finney would, and I think that kind of speaks to the unselfishness and Finney's willingness to give the ball up. Now, I know he had to play a huge role in terms of scoring at McCutcheon last year, just kind of out of necessity, but I think you put him around other great players, and he's going to be more than willing to give the ball up and set guys up.
Well, Alex, I know when we didn't give much resistance to McCutcheon. We were in a rebuilding year this year, but we heavily tried to guard him, and he let the game come to him, and he found the wing shooters in that situation.
Right. Yeah,
and then he got his points later.
Right.
But that was what was impressive. He wasn't trying to do more, and you're playing against a team that you're going to beat somewhat easily to go get yours type of thing. And nope, he played the game the right way and let it come to him. It was very impressive.
He seems really coachable too. Same thing with Romeo. Like they don't seem like they take what the coach is telling them is kind of a knock on them doing something wrong. They take the information and try to grow and get better from it. So that's another thing.
Great demeanor. They carry themselves with a presence that sometimes is missing from some of the top players.
I agree.
All right. Well, I'll push one of these questions into the last segment. So we'll hit the one about the.
How much time we have left?
We got about 5 minutes and 45 seconds.
Okay.
I got to do the outro. So about 6 minutes total left of recording. So we'll do that. There was a couple of schedule questions. There was another one about Brooks, Jackson Davis, and Watford. So we'll hit those, and that should probably take most of the time. So I'll try to give you guys a heads up in the chat here.
Okay.
When we get to that. All right, I'll get started here in a second. Welcome back. You're listening to the Assembly Call. I'm Andy Bottoms here with Coach Brian Tonsoni and Alex Bozich from Inside the Hall. And we've got a few minutes left, so I wanted to hit a few more of the questions that we received over the course of the week. This one came from Ben. Given a healthy roster, should IU be in the preseason top 25? And if so, where? Alex, I'll throw that one to you first.
Borderline, I would say. I think they could get some votes. But you never know with those things. Half of the people that vote in the preseason AP poll probably are football voters too, so they're not really too dialed into what's going on. I would say that obviously adding Romeo kind of just gives the buzz, and some people that may have been on the fringe otherwise are not really giving Indiana any thought. They could look at the fact that the recruiting class is ranked in the top 10 nationally. If Juwan comes back, and then adding Romeo Langford, and say, hey, maybe I'll toss him in there at 23 or 24, but I think it's probably 50-50 that they would fall somewhere maybe in the last couple spots. But they're definitely a team I think I could see them at least getting some votes in the preseason.
Brian, has the Delphi Bracketology Club done any early season bracket projections that we should be aware of and hang our hats on?
I have a freshman working on our preseason one already, or it'll be our spring one, and he was just working on it today. And we were discussing where IU would be, and so we're looking in the 20 to 35 range, possibly 50-50 again, without knowing a darn thing about who's coming back for the other guys and the NBA guys. So I think that I'd rather him not be in and have a little bit of motivation to move in. I think they're going to be a pretty solid tournament team, or have a good chance to make the tournament. So wherever that finds them.
Yeah, I would agree. I think they'll be on the low end. It just obviously depends where what other guys decide about coming back. But usually when you look at these early top 25 polls, there's about 15 teams that everybody's consistent on. And then you got about 20 to 25 that everybody kind of tucks in there that might be their, pet team or whatever that they really like and something like that. So I think IU will find their way into some of them, but probably not the majority. And we'll see what happens from there. Next question is from Adam. Regarding the schedule for next season, what's our non-conference look like so far? Do we know of any big-time games they're looking to set up? I know, Alex, you track this pretty well. I don't know that there's too much out there with the exception of the Butler game in the Crossroads. But anything else that you are aware of or you guys have on the site already that I have completely forgotten about?
Just the Louisville game at Assembly Hall.
Oh, that's right.
That's the week before the Butler game. And then I'm assuming that since they have done 2 straight ACC Big Ten home games, that they'll do a road game this year against an ACC team. And I think the dates for that have been moved up a little bit. I think November 26th through the 28th, because I'm assuming that there's going to be some Big Ten games again in early December. I think that worked out pretty well last year for the league. At least they liked, I think, having that, and the fact that they're going to 20 conference games. But other than that, I mean, it's going to be tough if they have Butler, Louisville, ACC Big Ten, and then 20 conference games. It's like, I don't know that there's room for necessarily another marquee game. I mean, you could have maybe one other, top 50, top 75-ish type team, but I don't know that you want to go too much beyond that, especially with a young team.
Yeah, it's one of those things with the Big Ten ACC. I think they throw out different options. I'm not really sure if there's an obvious choice. To your point, I think there's a road game, but I haven't looked enough to know who hasn't played road games. Who's due for a home game on the ACC side that would probably garner the kind of attention that they want. So,
well, they could also have a Gavitt Games matchup as well. I don't know. I know they were in it last year. They could have a home game there. But I mean, say you did have a Gavitt Games, you had ACC Big Ten, then you had those two other ones. I think the rest of you probably just want to go for some solid, obviously non-RPI killing games, but some games that you every team's going to schedule some games that they feel like they're going to win with almost near certainty. But we saw how that worked out last year as well.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of leads into a question from Brandon. Who would you guys like to see IU face in the Gavitt Games or the ACC Big Ten Challenge? Brian, I'll throw that one to you. Anybody you'd really like to see IU match up with?
I'm going to show my age. I'd like to see Georgetown. They were big when I was in high school. I did get a chance to see them over at Xavier this year. It was the first time I've ever seen Georgetown play, so I'd like to see Georgetown in Assembly Hall. I'd like to go play Virginia. Maybe not. That's a tough team to play, but Virginia or North Carolina State, when I was looking at it today, are teams that might be where IU is seeded 4th, 5th, 6th in the Big Ten, matched up with a similar team. But I'd like to see Georgetown come in, or I'd like to see Xavier, either one of those in the Gavitt Games.
Yeah, I think Xavier's interesting. I would like it, even if they played a road game at Xavier, it'd be right down the street from me. So I would be fine with that. As far as the Big Ten or the ACC Big Ten, I mean, maybe there's a chance they go to North Carolina again. I didn't really get a chance to look to see who's played in games recently. I could see them tacking that one on there, or maybe Virginia. But time will tell on what the schedule looks like. So we'll keep everybody up to date on that as more details emerge. But that's going to do it for us on this week's edition of the Assembly Call. If you want to see us do the show live and be part of the live chat, join us at assemblycall.com on Thursday nights for the live broadcast of our Assembly Call radio recording. Or you can always subscribe to our podcast by searching for the Assembly Call wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to go to assemblycall.com or text IU to 66866 to join our free email newsletter. Thank you for listening. We'll be back to talk IU hoops again with you next week. Until then, keep your elbows in and your eyes on the rim, and go Hoosiers. All right. We are all set. So one question we didn't get to, I'll throw this one out quickly, and then I'll let you guys go, was around the way it was worded was chances of getting Brooks, Jackson Davis, and Watford very slim. I assume that means getting all three of them is very slim.
Yeah.
The question was which player or two would be the best fit for the 2019-20 team? Alex, you're probably the one who has seen the most of these guys. I know I'm in no position to hazard a guess at this question.
I mean, they're all top 25 players nationally, so I don't think you can really go wrong. It's like, Watford was – Keon Brooks was awesome in EYBL and Indy. Trey Jackson Davis was great all season. And Watford, I think he even looked a lot better than a year ago. So, I don't know. I mean, you're asking me to pick between three great players. I think if you could get two of those guys, you'd be thrilled. Because they can all do different things and play together. I don't necessarily think you would be able to get all three, but if you get two of the three, I think you're doing really well. If you get one of them, you're doing well. So
yeah, I would agree. All right, I think we hit most of the questions. There was one about potential red shirts. Do you think there's any chance any of the freshmen would redshirt?
I have no idea of knowing that. I
don't know what Archie's philosophy on that really is compared to, some guys use that. I feel like they use it more than others. Last year you didn't really get a chance to see that just because of the way the roster was made up. So
Race did it.
He did it. That was a little bit unique because of the reclassification situation. And I think that was something that he was interested in.
Mm-hmm.
But I know some of the others, I know there's a handful of guys who really use that, to their advantage for some of the guys, but I just don't know that he's been in a position at IU enough to know.
Right. If you think you have 14 players that can play, then might not be a bad year to do it.
Yeah, I would think so. Oh well, we'll see. All right, good deal. Well, Alex, thanks for joining us. Brian, thanks for filling in
You're welcome.
again.
Thanks for having me.
I'm sure we'll be rotating around to get ourselves through the off season with everything going on. So appreciate it, Alex. Get some rest. Hopefully, we're out of scholarships, so hopefully nothing else for you to knock out this week, other than posting your stuff with Fitzner tonight.
Don't put any pressure on me.
All right. Well, no, I didn't say posting it tonight. I posted from your conversation tonight. You can post it whenever you want. That's up to you.
I'll wait a couple weeks. I'll go to sleep for a couple weeks and then I'll post it. All right, guys. Thanks for having me.
See you. Kids again. All right. We'll see you guys.
All right,
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.